Before we begin, if you find yourself drifting into the peculiar and often absurd corners of history with us, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions. Here, boredom is a virtue and sleep is optional. Our tales are designed to lull you into curiosity rather than slumber. Tonight, we delve into the first chapter of a story that promises to be as unbreakable as the gate it describes. Almost. Chapter 1. The Unbreakable Oath. The gate was called Indomitable. It was a name etched into the iron with the confidence of men who had never seen it tested. 18 feet tall, reinforced with bands of steel, and crowned with spikes meant to dissuade even the most ambitious climbers, it stood as the pride of the kingdom. The Duke of Harrowmount had commissioned it after a particularly vivid nightmare involving a horde of disgruntled peasants and the suspiciously flammable drawbridge. This gate, he declared, will never fall. And because dukes in those days had a habit of making pronouncements sound like natural laws, everyone nodded and agreed. Of course, calling something unbreakable is an invitation to the universe to prove you wrong. History is littered with unbreakable things that broke, the unsinkable ships that sank, the impenetrable walls that were penetrated, the immortal kings who died, often in humiliating ways. But the Duke, like all men who mistake weight for permanence, was certain, and so the oath was sworn. The guards of Indomitable Gate were chosen not for their skill, but for their ability to stand still for long periods without complaining. This was considered the highest virtue in gate guarding, a profession where excitement was either a sign of incompetence or impending doom. Their oath was simple: until the gate falls, so shall we. It sounded noble at the time. The first generation of guards took their duties seriously. They polished the hinges, oiled the bolts, and patrolled the battlements with the solemnity of monks tending a sacred relic. The second generation polished slightly less. By the third, the polishing was mostly theoretical, and the guards had developed a thriving side trade in selling authentic gate rusts to tourists. The gate, after all, was unbreakable. What was the worst that could happen? Then came the winter of the great thaw. The snows melted early, the rivers swelled, and the ground softened in a way that suggested the earth itself was reconsidering its life choices. The guards, now mostly relatives of the original oath sworn, leaned against the gate and debated whether the creaking sound was the wind or the hinges finally admitting defeat. It was neither. It was the sound of the gate's foundation shifting, a slow, groaning betrayal of physics. The guards, who had long since stopped believing in the gate's mythic invincibility, but had also stopped believing in consequences, blinked at one another. "Probably nothing," said the captain, a man who had gotten his position by being the only one who could read the duty roster. By midnight, the groaning had turned into a chorus of metallic protests. The guards, now huddled in the gatehouse playing dice, paused mid-game. "Should we check that?" asked one. The captain squinted at his losing hand and said, "It's unbreakable. Dice don't lie." Dice, as it turned out, were not engineers. By dawn, the gate had listed to one side like a drunk nobleman leaning on a servant. The guards, now fully awake but no wiser, poked at the buckling hinges with the detached curiosity of men who had never expected to do any real work. "Maybe if we push it back," one suggested. They pushed. The gate, in response, emitted a sound best described as a metallic sigh, and slumped further. By noon, the Duke's messenger arrived. The Duke, having been woken from a nap, was displeased. "What do you mean the gate is falling?" he demanded. The messenger, who had run the entire way, wheezed. "It's more like lying down now." The guards were summoned to explain themselves. They stood in the Duke's hall, shifting from foot to foot, their armor slightly rusty from neglect. "You swore an oath," the Duke said, his voice dripping with the kind of fury only a man who'd been proven embarrassingly wrong could muster. "You swore to stand until the gate fell." The captain, who had once read a book on legal loopholes, or at least the cover of one, cleared his throat. "Technically, my lord, the gate hasn't fallen. It's just reclining." The Duke's face turned a shade of red, usually reserved for overripe tomatoes. The guards, realizing that technicalities might not save them, began to regret not polishing the hinges more, or at all. And so, as the legendary Unbreakable gate settled into its new life as a very breakable sculpture, the guards faced the consequences of their oath. The Duke, unwilling to admit his gate was flawed but equally unwilling to let the guards off the hook, devised a punishment befitting the crime. They would guard the fallen gate forever, or at least until someone came up with a better idea. And so they stood, the oath-bound guardians of a ruin, watching over a gate that had against all odds broken the one thing it was never supposed to break: their trust. Chapter 2. A gate with a reputation. Legends, like rust, accumulate over time. By the time the indomitable gate had fully reclined into its new life as a semi-horizontal curiosity, the stories about it had already begun to mutate. Some claimed it had once withstood a battering ram forged from the bones of giants. Others whispered that its hinges had been blessed by a hermit who lived atop a mountain of prophecies, none of which had mentioned the gate eventually collapsing under its own weight. The truth, as usual, was far less dramatic. The gate had been built on slightly uneven ground, and the Duke's architect had been more interested in aesthetics than drainage. But facts never stood in the way of a good myth. The gate's reputation grew even as its physical form deteriorated. Traveling bards sang of its glory, conveniently omitting the part where it now resembled a drunk nobleman napping in a ditch. Parents told their children that the indomitable gate had fallen not from weakness, but from sheer exhaustion after centuries of holding back the tides of chaos. The guards who had spent those centuries napping in the gatehouse were less than thrilled with this interpretation. The current generation of guards, now mostly descendants of the original oath sworn, had the unenviable task of maintaining the gate's legacy while standing next to its very obvious failure. Their uniforms, once gleaming symbols of duty, had faded to a shade of gray that suggested prolonged exposure to disappointment. Their helmets, polished weakly out of habit rather than pride, reflected only the resigned expressions of men who knew they were part of a joke no one would explain to them. Captain Willem, the latest in a long line of captains who had gotten the job by default, often found himself staring at the gate's slumped form and wondering how things had gone so wrong. His great-great-grandfather had sworn an oath to guard an impenetrable fortress. Willem guarded a gate that couldn't even keep out stray dogs. The psychological toll was immense. Every morning, the guards lined up in front of the gate, saluted it with the enthusiasm of men attending their own funerals, and then spent the rest of the day pretending not to notice how it listed further to the left every time it rained. Tourists came to gawk, pointing and murmuring things like, "That's the Unbreakable gate?" in tones that suggested they were deeply reconsidering their life choices. The guards developed a standard response. It's symbolic. The Duke, meanwhile, had decided that if the gate couldn't be unbreakable, it could at least be profitable. He commissioned pamphlets proclaiming the gate's heroic sacrifice and sold pieces of its rusted hinges as holy relics. "Guaranteed authentic," the vendors shouted. "Only slightly more authentic than the gate's unbreakability." Pilgrims flocked to see the fallen marvel, and the guards found themselves less of a military unit and more of a poorly paid tourist attraction. The final insult came when the Duke's new herald, a man with a voice like a goose being stepped on, announced that the gate's collapse had been part of a divine plan. "The gate fell," he proclaimed, "so that we might learn the true meaning of strength." The guards, who had learned the true meaning of back pain from hauling tourists out of the mud where the gate used to stand, were not impressed. Willem began to notice something peculiar. The more the gate's reputation inflated, the heavier the weight on his shoulders became. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of pretending a pile of bent metal was still a functioning fortress. It was the sheer absurdity of it all. He had sworn an oath to guard a legend, but the legend had outgrown the reality, and now he was trapped in the gap between them. One evening, as he sat on what was left of the gate's base, now repurposed as a bench for tired pilgrims, a child approached him. The boy stared at the gate, then at Willem, then back at the gate. Did it really hold back an army of demons? He asked. Willem looked at the crooked metal, the weeds growing through its cracks, and the pigeon perched on one of its spikes like a tiny feathered critic. Yes, he said. And then it got tired, so now we got its rest. The boy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. And maybe it did. After all, the gate was unbreakable in the way all legends were, not because it was true, but because people needed it to be. Willem sighed and adjusted his helmet. The gate might have fallen, but the oath hadn't. And so, like the hinges he still oiled out of habit, he kept going. Chapter 3. The first crack appears. It began with a sound, a faint, almost apologetic e.g. ping, like a pebble dropping into a well if the well were made of neglected iron, and the pebble were the final straw of structural integrity. Guardsman Rolf heard it first. He was leaning against the indomitable gate, as much out of habit as necessity, because standing upright for entire shifts had long ago been deemed unnecessarily strenuous. The sound was so quiet that at first he thought it might be his own joints protesting another day of existence. But then he saw it, a hairline crack, no longer than his pinky finger snaking its way across one of the gates, many decorative, and as it turned out, load-bearing embellishments. Rolf blinked. He had been a guard for 12 years, which meant he had spent roughly 11 years and 11 months perfecting the art of not noticing things. A crack in the gate was very much a thing that fell under the category of not his problem. The gate was already fallen, already broken, already a glorified bench for pilgrims and a perch for disinterested pigeons. What was one more crack? And yet, he crouched, a movement that, like most of his physical actions these days, was accompanied by a symphony of pops and creaks, and squinted at the fissure. It was thin, almost delicate, like a spider's web spun in metal. It was the kind of crack that could be ignored by a man with a healthy sense of self-preservation. Unfortunately, Rolf had long ago traded his self-preservation for a steady paycheck and the right to nap in the gatehouse during thunderstorms. He straightened up and glanced around. The other guards were engaged in their usual midday activities, dozing, arguing about whether moss counted as a vegetable, and attempting to balance spoons on their noses. None of them had noticed the crack. None of them would care if they had. Reporting this would mean paperwork. It might even mean Herford. Rolf weighed his options. On one hand, if he reported the crack, he would be the one stuck filling out forms in triplicate while someone higher up debated whether the crack was aesthetic or catastrophic. On the other hand, if he didn't report it and the gate finally gave up entirely, he would be the one buried under several tons of ironic rubble. He prodded the crack with a cautious finger. The metal did not crumble. It did not even groan. It simply existed, a tiny fault line in the myth of the indomitable gate. Rolf sighed. He had seen enough of the world to know that small cracks had a way of becoming big problems, usually at the most inconvenient times. But he had also seen enough of bureaucracy to know that reporting a problem was a surefire way to make it his permanent responsibility. That night, back in the cramped, damp barracks he shared with 7 other guards, all of whom snored like bears who had just discovered ale, Rolf lay awake. The crack haunted him. It wasn't the size that troubled him. It was the implication. The gate wasn't supposed to crack. It was supposed to be beyond such petty concerns as structural integrity. It was supposed to be a symbol, and symbols weren't supposed to have flaws you could poke with your finger. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would tell Captain Willem. Not because he cared about the gate's well-being, but because if the thing finally collapsed, he didn't want to be the only one who had seen it coming. Willem, as it turned out, was in the middle of losing an arm wrestling match to a particularly determined sausage when Rolf found him. The captain wiped grease from his chin and squinted at Rolf. "A crack," he repeated, as if Rolf had just announced that the sky was blue and the Duke was an idiot. "In the ADT?" "Yes, sir." Willem sighed and rubbed his temples. "How big?" Rolf held up his pinky. Willem stared at him. "That's it? It's still growing, sir?" "Growing how fast?" Rolf hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe a fingernail's worth a day." Willem exhaled through his nose. "So, by my calculations, in about 50 years, we'll have a real problem." Rolf opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Willem had a point. The gate had taken centuries to fall the first time. A crack this small was practically a non-issue. Except that afternoon, as Rolf took his turn polishing the gate's remaining intact hinges, a task as pointless as it was eternal, he noticed something. The crack had grown. Not much. Maybe the width of a hair. But it was undeniably longer. He poked it again. The metal, for the first time, made a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible, creaking. Rolf stepped back. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he had spent enough years guarding a fallen gate to know that some things had a sense of humor. And if the universe had decided that the indomitable gate's final act would be to crumble one microscopic piece at a time, just to torment the man who noticed, then so be it. He resolved to keep quiet. If the gate wanted to fall apart in slow motion, let it. He had an oath to uphold, and nowhere in that oath did it say he had to care. That night, as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he dreamed of cracks. They spread across the sky, the earth, the faces of his fellow guards. And somewhere beneath the weight of it all, the gate sighed. Not in defeat, but in relief. Finally, someone had noticed. Chapter 4. The Art of Looking Busy. After Rolf's discovery of the crack, or more accurately, after Rolf's ill-advised decision to mention the crack to others, the guards of the indomitable gate developed a sudden and profound appreciation for the art of not seeing things. This was not an entirely new skill for them. They had, after all, spent years perfecting the ability to not see tourists carving their initials into the gate's base, nor the way pigeons had turned its spikes into nesting sites, nor the slow but inevitable creep of rust across what remained of its surface. But the crack was different. The crack was raw observable, and observable things had a nasty habit of becoming reportable things, which in turn had an even nastier habit of becoming work. So the guards adapted. Their first innovation was the patrol of intent. This involved striding with great purpose from one end of the gate to the other, brows furrowed in concentration, hands clasped behind backs in the universal posture of men engaged in very important tasks. The key was to move just quickly enough to avoid scrutiny, but just slowly enough to appear thorough. Any faster, and they might be accused of rushing. Any slower, and someone might ask what they were looking at. The perfect balance was achieved by Sergeant Edric, who had once trained as a mime before a tragic misunderstanding involving a real box. And a very angry merchant. Edric could pace for hours in a manner that suggested he was moments away from uncovering a dire threat, all while seeing absolutely nothing at all. Their second innovation was the ritual of the shining hinge. Every morning, without fail, 3 guards would gather at the gate's least corroded hinge and polish it with the solemn intensity of priests performing a sacrament. It didn't matter that the hinge hadn't moved in decades, nor that their efforts made no discernible difference to its appearance. What mattered was the appearance of effort. The hinge, gleaming dully in the weak morning light, became a shield against suspicion. No one could accuse them of negligence while they were actively engaged in the maintenance of the gate. Never mind that the rest of the gate flaked like an old sunburn. The hinge was pristine, and that was enough. Their third and most inspired innovation was the doctrine of selective attention. This unwritten but fiercely enforced rule stated that any flaw in the gate could be ignored as long as no one acknowledged it aloud. A new crack. Unfortunate, but hardly worth mentioning. A suspicious groaning noise. Probably the wind. The gate listing another inch to the left? An optical illusion caused by the angle of the sun. The doctrine was upheld with the fervor of a holy commandment, and woe betide any new recruit who failed to grasp its importance. Young Timmons, fresh from his mother's farm and still brimming with the misguided enthusiasm of the uninitiated, had once made the mistake of pointing out that one of the gate's spikes had gone missing. The resulting silence had been so profound that Timmons later claimed he could hear his own future career ending. He was reassigned to latrine duty for a month, during which time he learned the most valuable lesson of his profession. It wasn't the gate that needed guarding. It was the illusion of the gate. Captain Willem, for his part, turned a blind eye to these practices. He had been a guard long enough to understand the delicate ecosystem of denial that kept them all employed. Asking questions was the first step toward answers, and answers had a habit of being inconvenient. Better to let the men busy themselves with harmless routines than to risk someone digging too deeply into the gate's actual condition. Besides, he had his own rituals to maintain, chiefly the biweekly submission of reports that were equal parts fiction and obfuscation. Gate remained steadfast, he wrote, in a hand so cramped it suggested either urgency or illiteracy. Hinges well-oiled, morale high. The Duke's scribes, who had long ago stopped reading these reports, filed them away in a drawer that had not been opened in years. The system worked. The guards stayed employed. The gate continued its slow but dignified collapse. And the world, blissfully unaware, moved on, until the day the crow landed. It was an unremarkable crow, as crows went, glossy black, mildly judgmental, and possessed of the casual arrogance common to all creatures that know they can fly away at any moment. It alighted on one of the gate's remaining spikes and peered down at the guards with an air of detached amusement. Then it hopped. The spike snapped off. The crow, visibly affronted, flapped away. The spike hit the ground with a clang that echoed through the courtyard. The guards froze. Timmons, who had not yet fully internalized the doctrine of selective attention, opened his mouth. Sergeant Edric, with reflexes honed by years of avoiding responsibility, kicked him sharply in the shin. Timmons yelped and closed his mouth. There was a long, strained silence. Then, with the solemnity of men performing a funeral rite, the guards turned their backs on the fallen spike and resumed their patrols. The ritual of the shining hinge was conducted with particular vigor that morning. Captain Willem's next report included a cheerful note about the gate's excellent avian deterrence. And no one, not even Rolf, mentioned the new crack that had appeared where the spike used to be. Some things were better left unseen. Chapter 5. The night the gate groaned. The storm arrived without invitation, the kind of weather that seemed personally offended by the concept of shelter. Rain came first in tentative droplets, then in sheets that turned the courtyard into a shallow lake. Wind followed, howling through the gaps in the indomitable gate like a bored god testing the limits of human patience. The guards had weathered storms before, of course, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't the water seeping into their boots, or the way their cloaks clung to their backs like desperate lovers. It was the noise. The gate was singing, or groaning, or perhaps protesting its continued existence in this mortal realm. The sounds started as low creaks, the sort of noises one might expect from an elderly chair reluctantly accommodating an unexpected guest. Then came the metallic shrieks, high-pitched and insistent, as if the gate were trying to communicate in a language composed entirely of dying hinges. By midnight, the sounds had evolved into something resembling speech, long drawn-out syllables of rusted metal that formed words only in the darkest corners of a sleep-deprived mind. Rolf stood under the dubious shelter of the gatehouse eaves, watching water cascade off what remained of the gate's arch. "That's new," he said, nodding toward a particularly enthusiastic groan. Sergeant Edric, who had once survived an avalanche by pretending it wasn't happening, shrugged. "Ban, Bills. Another groan, this one longer and distinctly questioning in tone. Definitely wind, Edric said, with the conviction of a man who had staked his pension on being wrong about nothing. Young Timmons, who had been promoted from latrine duty to gate watcher, a position created specifically to keep him from asking questions elsewhere, peered into the downpour. What if it's attackers, using the storm as cover? The other guards turned to look at him. The silence that followed was broken only by the gate, emitting a sound best described as a rusty chuckle. "Timmons," Rolf said, "when was the last time we had attackers?" Timmons opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know. Before my time?" "Before anyone's time," Rolf corrected. "The last army that came within 5 miles of this gate stopped to have lunch, took one look at our legendary defenses, and decided they'd rather besiege a different kingdom with standards." A particularly loud groan interrupted him, this one accompanied by a shower of rust flakes that sizzled as they hit the waterlogged ground. Edric scratched his chin. "Could be the Duke testing us, sending men to rattle the gate, see if we're alert." Rolf considered this. "Does the Duke strike you as the sort to be out in this weather?" They all turned to look toward the castle, where warm light glowed in the highest windows. Somewhere in that cozy keep, the Duke was undoubtedly enjoying spiced wine and a roaring fire while telling guests exaggerated stories about the gate's glory days. Another groan, this one lower, almost mournful. Timmons shifted uncomfortably. What if it's the gate itself? Like, it's finally... He trailed off, unwilling to say the words. "Finally what?" Edric asked. "Giving up?" The guards contemplated this possibility. The rain continued its assault. The gate continued its metallic lament. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flashed, illuminating the gate silhouette, no longer the proud barrier of legend, but a hunched, skeletal thing that seemed to be melting into the earth. Rolf sighed. "Let's say it's the gate. Let's say it's finally had enough. What exactly are we supposed to do about it?" The silence that followed was punctuated by the gate answering for them. A long, shuddering creak that built to a resonant wang as another spike gave up its centuries-long battle with gravity and plunged into the mud below. Edric cleared his throat. "I vote we call it wind." "Seconded," Rolf said. Timmons opened his mouth, then closed it as both older guards fixed him with looks that promised latrine duty until retirement if he spoke another word. They spent the rest of the shift huddled in the gatehouse, playing dice by candlelight, while the storm raged and the gate composed what sounded increasingly like a farewell symphony. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the gate's complaints had subsided to occasional whimpers. The guards emerged to assess the damage. 3 more spikes had fallen. Several new cracks had appeared, branching across the gate's surface like lightning frozen in iron. The rightmost hinge had developed a tilt that suggested it was considering early retirement. Captain Willem arrived for morning inspection, took one look at the gate, and said, "Looks fine." No one argued. That afternoon, the Duke's herald arrived with a proclamation. The previous night's storm had been a test from the heavens, and the indomitable gate had stood firm against the assault. The guards received medals for their vigilance. They pinned them to their uniforms and tried not to notice how the gate, when the wind blew just right, now emitted a sound that was unmistakably laughter. Chapter 6. The Architect's Secret. The indomitable gate had never been intended to last. This fact would have shocked the Duke, the guards, and the countless pilgrims who came to marvel at its legendary resilience. But it would not have surprised Master Builder Havelock, the perpetually under-caffeinated architect who had designed the gate with 2 guiding principles: aesthetics over function and malicious compliance over integrity. Havelock had never wanted to build a gate. He had been perfectly content designing wine cellars and ornamental fountains before the Duke summoned him to create the mightiest barrier the kingdom had ever seen. The Duke, like most noblemen with more money than sense, had grand visions but vague specifications. "Make it imposing," he had commanded. "Make it terrifying. make it so that no enemy would dare approach. Then he had gone hunting for 3 months, leaving Havelock with a budget that shrank every time the Duke's treasurer got drunk. The first compromise came with the foundation. Proper gate foundations required deep pilings, quality stone, and precise leveling. What Havelock got was a swampy patch of land that the Duke insisted was strategically important. Translation. It looked impressive from his bedroom window. When Havelock pointed out that the ground was about as stable as the Duke's temper after a bad hunt, the treasurer waved him off. "Just pack it with gravel and call it a day," he said. "No one looks at foundations anyway." The second compromise came with the materials. The Duke wanted iron so pure it sings. The treasurer bought iron from a suspicious merchant who claimed his ingots were blessed by mountain spirits, and who may or may not have melted down farming tools to meet demand. Havelock, upon testing the metal, discovered it had the structural integrity of aged cheese. He considered speaking up. Then he considered the Duke's infamous reaction to bad news, which usually involved shouting and the sudden reassignment of messengers to latrine-digging duty, and decided some things were better left unsaid. The third and most damning compromise came with the design itself. The Duke, upon his return from hunting, took one look at the half-finished gate and declared it insufficiently intimidating. "Where are the spikes?" he demanded. "Where are the menacing flourishes?" Havelock, who had been working on the assumption that a gate's primary purpose was to, each gatey sighed and added spikes. Then more spikes. Then decorative spikes on top of the functional spikes. By the time the Duke was satisfied, the gate resembled a porcupine that had fallen into a blacksmith's forge. It was during the final inspection that Havelock made his quiet rebellion. As the Duke marveled at his creation, declaring it unbreakable and eternal, Havelock took a chisel and, in a hidden corner of the gate's framework, carved a single word. "Eventually?" No one noticed. The Duke held a grand celebration for the gate's completion, during which Havelock drank himself into a stupor and quietly accepted a new commission in a faraway province. By the time the first guard took up his post, the architect was already miles away, designing a bridge with the same careful disregard for longevity. Years passed. The gate's legend grew. The Duke's nightmares about peasant revolts faded. The foundation settled unevenly. The iron, never particularly strong to begin with, began its slow surrender to rust. The spikes, overloaded by their own decorative weight, developed stress fractures invisible to the naked eye. And deep within the gate's structure, hidden beneath layers of paint and pigeon droppings, Havelock's carving endured. Eventually. It was perhaps the only part of his design that worked exactly as intended. Back in the present, as the current generation of guards debated whether the gate's latest groan was wind or prophecy, a particularly heavy rain washed away a century's worth of grime from the gate's base. Timmons, during one of his endless patrols, glanced down and saw something glint in the mud. He crouched, ignoring the protests of his knees, and brushed away the dirt. There, barely visible beneath the peeling iron, was a word. He stared at it. Then, with the slow dawning horror of a man realizing the joke was on him, he started laughing. The other guards found him there minutes later, still chuckling, tears mixing with the rain on his face. When they asked what was so funny, he simply pointed at the gate. They looked, and for the first time in generations, someone finally saw what Havelock had left behind. Eventually. Adric squinted. "Is that?" Rolf, after a long silence, sighed. "No. It's a warning." The gate groaned again, louder this time, as if amused by their belated understanding. Somewhere, in whatever afterlife awaits architects with dark senses of humor, Havelock was laughing too. Chapter 7. The Guard Who Knew Too Much. Timmons had never been particularly good at numbers, but he was excellent at patterns. and the pattern emerging from the indomitable gate's recent behavior was troubling. It began with simple observations. The crack Rolf had discovered now stretched 3 handspans. The missing spikes had left behind pockmarks that wept rust in the rain. The hinge they polished so religiously had developed a tilt that defied both physics and optimism. These were facts. And facts, Timmins had come to realize, had weight. One sleepless night in the barracks, he made the mistake of doing the math. If the primary crack grew at a rate of 1 finger width per week, conservative estimate, and the remaining structural supports covered approximately 20 feet, generous estimate, then simple division suggested the gate had between 6 months, and never before it surrendered completely to entropy. Timmins wrote these calculations in the margins of a duty roster, then immediately regretted it. Numbers made the problem real in a way that vague unease never could. He considered sharing his findings with the others, but one look at their blissfully ignorant faces changed his mind. Sergeant Edric was busy teaching a rook. Chapter 8. The annual inspection farce. The royal inspector arrived on the first clear day after a fortnight of rain, when the morning light cast flattering shadows across the indomitable gate's crumbling facade. His entourage consisted of 3 clerks, 2 guards who looked equally terrified of combat and paperwork, and a page boy whose sole responsibility appeared to be holding an inkpot at precisely the right height for bureaucratic convenience. Captain Willem had prepared for this moment with the same strategic precision generals reserved for battlefield maneuvers. The guards stood at attention in freshly brushed uniforms. The mud had been scraped off that morning. The shining hinge gleamed with suspicious intensity. An entire jar of oil had been sacrificed to the cause. And most importantly, a carefully curated path had been established through the courtyard, one that kept visitors at least 6 paces from the gate's most obvious flaws. "Your Excellency," Willem said with a bow that managed to convey both respect and a subtle plea for mercy, "welcome to our humble post." Inspector Geralt, a man whose face had settled into permanent disapproval sometime during the previous decade, surveyed the scene with the enthusiasm of someone inspecting a corpse. "Yes, yes," he said, waving a hand that seemed to dismiss the entire concept of gates. "Let's get this over with. The king expects his report by noon." What followed was a masterpiece of bureaucratic theater. The inspection consisted primarily of Geralt squinting at the gate from various angles while making approving noises. At no point did he approach close enough to notice the cracks. At no point did he test the hinges. When one of his clerks produced a checklist titled AAET Structural Integrity Assessment, Geralt signed it without reading, then handed it back with the air of a man who had just performed a great alchemy by transforming work into someone else's problem. "This gate," Geralt announced, "appears to be in excellent condition." Behind him, the gate emitted a soft creak that sounded suspiciously like laughter. The clerks nodded vigorously. One of them, a young man with the haunted look of someone who had recently learned how pensions worked, ventured to ask, "Shouldn't we examine it more closely?" Geralt fixed him with a stare that could have curdled milk. "Do you question my assessment?" "No, Your Excellency. It's just dust." "Just what?" The clerk's eyes darted to the gate, where a fresh trickle of rust had begun winding its way down from one of the spikes, like a slow-motion tear. "Nothing, Your Excellency. The gate is magnificent." "Exactly." Geralt turned to Willem. "Your men have done exemplary work maintaining this vital defensive structure." Willem bowed again, hiding his face lest it betray any unseemly expressions. "We live to serve, Your Excellency." The farce might have concluded there had not young Timmins, whose grasp of self-preservation remained tenuous at best, blurted out, "It's leaning another 2 inches since last month." A silence fell over the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. The gate, perhaps sensing the shift in mood, chose that moment to shed a flake of metal the size of a dinner plate. Geralt looked at the fallen debris, then at Timmons, then at Willem, then back at the debris. "Nonsense," he said at last. "That's clearly maintenance debris. From routine upkeep." He gestured to one of his clerks. "Note that in the report, routine upkeep debris." Timmons opened his mouth again. Willem stepped on his foot with precisely calculated force. The inspection concluded with Geralt dictating a glowing report to his ink-stained scribes. "The indomitable gate stands as strong as the day it was built," he proclaimed. "A testament to the kingdom's enduring might. The guards stationed here demonstrate commendable vigilance in maintaining this crucial bastion of our defenses." As the inspector's party mounted their horses to depart, Geralt leaned down to Willem and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "For the love of all that's holy, keep it standing until next year's inspection." Willem nodded. "We'll do our best, Your Excellency." Geralt sighed. "See that you do. If this gate falls on my watch, I'll see every last one of you reassigned to the northern marshes." As the inspector's retinue disappeared down the road, the guards gathered around the latest addition to the courtyard, the dinner plate-sized piece of their supposedly impervious gate. Edric poked it with his boot. "Should we do something about this?" Willem considered the fragment, then the gate, then the now empty road. "Throw it in the bushes," he said at last, "and someone polish that hinge again." The guards returned to their posts. The gate continued its slow-motion collapse, and high above the sun shone down on what was officially, according to royal decree and 3 signed copies of paperwork, the finest, sturdiest, most impenetrable gate in the kingdom. Somewhere in the administrative halls of power, a clerk filed the report in a drawer marked "Completed Inspections," where it would gather dust until the day someone needed proof that no one could possibly have seen this coming. Chapter 9. The Peasant Who Poked It. The village of Harrow's Hollow celebrated the harvest festival with the kind of enthusiasm that inevitably led to poor decisions. This year's crowning achievement of bad judgment belonged to one Jem the Cooper, a barrel maker whose talents included holding liquor and very little else. By midnight, Jem had consumed enough ale to float a small ship, and had decided with the unshakable conviction of the profoundly inebriated that the indomitable gate needed testing. "It's called Indomitable," he slurred to his equally drunk companions. "Let's see how indomitable it really is." The guards were playing dice in the gatehouse when they heard the first thud. "That's not the wind," Rolf said, pausing mid-roll. Edric sighed and pushed aside the dice. "Probably just another pilgrim trying to chip off a souvenir." The second thud was louder. Timmons peered out the window. "There's a man headbutting the gate." Willem closed his eyes and silently counted to 5. When that didn't help, he stood. "Right, let's go explain why that's a bad idea." By the time they reached the courtyard, Jem had graduated from headbutts to full-body charges. His latest attempt left him sprawled in the mud, giggling at the sky while his friends cheered. The gate, for its part, now sported a new feature. A gem-sized dent that looked disturbingly like a surprised face. "Evening, gentlemen," Willem said in the tone of someone trying very hard not to commit murder. "Is there a problem?" Jem rolled onto his stomach and beamed up at the captain. "Captain, tell your gate to stop hitting me back." Willem looked at the dent. The dent did not look back, but it somehow managed to convey smugness. Rolf crouched next to Jem. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jem squinted at the gate. "Made it more expressive." The guards exchanged glances. This was bad. This was very bad. The annual inspection had been a farce, but at least Geralt had been professionally obligated to pretend not to see the gate's deterioration. Jem had no such constraints, and by morning, all of Harrow's Hollow would know that the legendary indomitable gate could be dented by a drunk Cooper with poor life choices. Willem made a decision. "Right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to stand up, walk away, and forget this ever happened. Jem frowned. But Willem grabbed the front of his tunic and hauled him to his feet. Alternatively, I can arrest you for defacing royal property. That comes with 5 years in the mines. Your choice. Jem's eyes widened. You can do that? I can do worse, Willem said, with a cheerfulness that made Timmons take a step back. Jem sobered up faster than a sinner in a monastery. I don't remember anything, he announced to the sky. Must have been sleepwalking. His friend, suddenly very interested in studying the stars, nodded vigorously. The guards watched them stagger away, then turned their attention to the den. Edric poked it. That's not great. Rolf sighed. We could call it a decorative feature. Willem rubbed his temples. It looks like the gate is screaming. Timmons, ever the optimist, brightened. What if we say it's always been there, like a maker's mark? Willem considered this. He considered the alternative, namely, explaining to the Duke why his supposedly invincible gate could be damaged by a man whose greatest achievement was surviving his own brewing. Then he looked at the gate's new expression, which did indeed resemble a face caught mid-shriek. Get the blacksmith, he said at last. The village blacksmith, a woman named Marta, who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything involving the guards, arrived at dawn with her tools and a healthy sense of skepticism. She took one look at the dent and snorted. You want me to fix that? Willem nodded. Make it look like nothing happened. Marta crossed her arms. I can hammer it out, but it'll still be visible. That metal's weaker than my grandmother's knees. Just... Willem gestured helplessly. Make it less creamy. By noon, the dent had been transformed from a horrified face to a vaguely oval depression that, if you squinted and had recently suffered head trauma, might pass for intentional. The guard surveyed the repairs. That's better? Timmons ventured. Edric sighed. It's still a dent. Rolf patted the gate. But now it's a why mysterious dent. Willem made a mental note to increase patrols during future festivals. Right. From now on we tell people it's always been there. A design feature, maybe a symbolic representation of the gate's indomitable spirit. The gate, perhaps offended by this blatant rewriting of history, chose that moment to shed another flake of rust directly onto Willem's boot. The captain ignored it. And if anyone asks, Jem the Cooper was never here. As the guards dispersed to begin the day's patrols, now with the additional task of spreading convincing lies, the gate stood sentinel, its new imperfection gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Somewhere in the village, Jem the Cooper woke with a pounding headache and the nagging feeling he'd learned something important last night. But between the ale and Willem's threats, the memory remained stubbornly out of reach. And so the legend of the indomitable gate endured, slightly dented, but no less implausible. Chapter 10. The day the gate moved. The incident occurred during the quiet hour between the night watch and dawn patrol, when even the most dutiful guards succumbed to the temptation of leaning against whatever surface wasn't actively crumbling. Young Timmons had drawn the short straw for perimeter check, which meant he alone was present when the indomitable gate sighed like an old man settling into a bath and shifted 3 inches to the left. At first he thought it was sleep deprivation. Then he thought it might be the ground settling. Then the gate creaked again, and there was no mistaking it. The damn thing had moved. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but with the quiet inevitability of a glacier or bureaucrat's promotion. Timmons approached with the caution one might reserve for a sleeping bear. He pressed a hand against the cold metal and felt it vibrate beneath his palm like a tuning fork struck by a particularly passive-aggressive god. When the morning shift arrived, they found him still standing there, pale as parchment, still touching the gate, as if trying to convince himself it was real. You look like you've seen a ghost, Rolf said, tossing him a waterskin. Timmons accepted it with numb fingers. The gate moved. The cheerful clatter of armor being adjusted stopped. Edric cleared his throat. Wind? It wasn't the wind, Timmons said. His voice sounded strange even to himself, too loud in the quiet courtyard. It just shifted, like it was getting comfortable. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for funerals and tax assessments. Sergeant Edric suddenly became very interested in adjusting his gauntlets. Rolf examined the sky, as though it might offer an escape route. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their cooing. Captain Willem arrived to find his men standing in a loose semicircle around Timmons, like jurors afraid to deliver a verdict. What's this? Timmons opened his mouth, but Edric cut in. Nothing, Captain, just discussing patrol rotations. Willem's gaze slid from Edmund's too casual shrug to Rolf's fixed smile to Timmons' haunted expression. His eyes narrowed. Right. Well, I'm changing the schedule. Timmons, you're on gatehouse duty today. Alone. The unspoken message was clear. I keep your delusions to yourself. As the others hurried away with the relief of men dodged an arrow, Timmons was left staring at the gate. The morning light caught fresh stress fractures, spider webbing out from the hinges. The repaired dent from Jem's drunken escapade now resembled a winking eye. And if he wasn't mistaken, the whole structure had developed a new tilt, like a drunkard leaning against a lamppost. Inside the gatehouse, the duty log lay open on the desk. Timmons picked up the quill, hesitated, then wrote in careful script, "By dawn patrol quiet. Nothing to report. Outside, the gate creaked again. A slow, drawn-out sound that might have been metal settling or something far worse. Timmons slammed the log shut. That evening, the guards gathered in the tavern with unusual enthusiasm. The conversation stayed carefully light. Weather ale, the likelihood of the Duke's new tax collector being bribable. No one mentioned Gates. No one looked Timmons in the eye. When Rolf drunkenly proposed a toast to things that stay where you put them, the others laughed a beat too loud and drank a swallow too deep. Back at the castle walls, the indomitable gate stood silent under the moonlight. If it had moved again in the interim, there was no one there to bear witness. And in the barracks, Timmons lay awake long into the night, listening to the distant metallic groans, and wondering if he was the only sane man in the company, or if the others had simply perfected the art of not hearing what they didn't want to know. The answer, as with most things concerning the gate, was probably both. Chapter 11. The rumor mill grinds. Timmons should have known better than to trust the silence. By week's end, his confession about the moving gate had traveled through the ranks like dysentery through a siege camp, leaving everyone worse off and no one willing to admit where it started. The first retelling came from Rolf to the stablemaster's apprentice during a late-night dice game where it gained dramatic embellishments. The gate didn't just shift, it stretched like a waking dragon. By the time this version reached the castle cooks, the gate was allegedly breathing. Edric, ever the pragmatist, tried to squash the rumors by declaring them ridiculous to the blacksmith's daughter. Unfortunately, his definition of ridiculous, as if a gate could move on its own without at least DTE structural failures first, only served to validate the growing panic. The barracks became a hotbed of whispered theories. Guards who had spent years perfecting the art of not noticing now saw omens in every creak. Old Tom claimed the gate moaned in harmony with the wind. New recruit Petya swore it shivered when clouds passed over the moon. Even Sergeant Edric begrudgingly admitted the hinges now groaned in a distinctly conversational tone. Captain Willem watched the paranoia spread, with the grim acceptance of a man watching floodwaters rise. His attempts to restore order, it's an iron gate, not a fortune-teller, only spawned new legends about prophetic metal. The more he denied, the more creative the theories became. By month's end, the guards had developed elaborate rituals to appease their crumbling charge. They oiled the hinges at precise intervals, like priests tending an altar. They avoided stepping on the gate's shadow at noon, when it stretched longest across the courtyard. They took to calling it the old man in hushed tones, as though it might appreciate the respect. The breaking point came when 3 guards refused night watch, claiming the gate watched them back. Willem responded by assigning them permanent latrine duty and instituting a new rule. Anyone caught spreading gate superstitions would spend a week mucking stables with their teeth. This worked exactly as well as expected. Within days the guards developed coded language. Fair weather today meant the gate hadn't moved. Bit windy signaled fresh cracks. Storm coming was reserved for days, when entire flakes of metal sloughed off like dead skin. Timmons, now treated as both oracle and pariah, took to eating his meals alone in the gatehouse. There he kept meticulous notes on the gate's decline in a ledger marked weather observations. The pages told a damning story. April 12th, small groan at moonrise. April 17th, lower hinge sounds congested. April 23rd, entire left side sighs when touched. He showed these records to no one. The rumors eventually reached the Duke's court, where they were dismissed as peasant superstition. Right up until the evening, a visiting diplomat asked about the famous living gate. The Duke's response, sending Captain Willem a strongly worded scroll demanding explanations, only made things worse. Willem read the scroll, burned it, and announced to his men, "The next person who mentions the gate doing anything except standing still will be reassigned to the northern ice quarries." The guards nodded solemnly. That night, as they took their posts, not a single man turned his back on the indomitable gate. And the gate, for its part, remained ominously still, as if waiting to see what the fools guarding it would imagine next. Chapter 12. The Captain's Motivational Speech. Captain Willem surveyed his troops with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 2 decades turning blind eyes into an art form. The guards stood at attention in the morning light, their uniforms brushed, their helmets polished, their collective gaze fixed firmly on anything except the indomitable gate looming behind him. Willem cleared his throat, shifting his stance to perfectly block the view of the gate's most prominent crack. A jagged lightning bolt of structural failure that had recently begun emitting a faint whistling sound in high winds. "Men of the Harrowmount Gate Guard," he began, his voice ringing with the kind of artificial enthusiasm usually reserved for royal weddings and executions. "Today marks the 127th anniversary of our order's founding." This was technically true, if one counted the years before the gate had become more concept than barrier. For over a century, our predecessors have stood watch at this post with honor, with dignity, and most important. He paused for effect, carefully adjusting his position as a gust of wind made the gate moan behind him, with absolute attention to duty. Sergeant Edric coughed violently. Rolf developed a sudden fascination with his bootlaces. Timmons stared straight ahead with the glassy-eyed focus of a man mentally composing his will. Willem pressed on. "I know there have been rumors." The gate chose this moment to shed a flake of rust the size of a dinner plate, which hit the cobblestones with a metallic clang that echoed through the courtyard. Willem didn't flinch. "Unfounded rumors," he continued, raising his voice slightly over the sound of the debris skittering across stone, "about the condition of our charge." He gestured broadly behind him without turning, his hand carefully positioned to indicate the general concept of gates rather than the specific crumbling monument at his back. "But I'm here to tell you that traditions matter, oaths matter, and this—" He hesitated for the briefest moment as the gate emitted a sound like a dying tea kettle. "This proud symbol of our kingdom's strength remains as vital today as it was when first erected." A faint grinding noise came from the direction of the hinges. Willem's eye twitched almost imperceptibly. "Some may question what we do here," he continued, his voice taking on the fervor of a man determined to outshout reality. "Some may wonder if standing guard over this—" Another pause as the gate settled another half-inch to the left with a groan. This magnificent bastion of security is still necessary in these modern times. He drew his sword with a flourish, the steel catching the sunlight in a way that conveniently drew every eye away from the slow-motion collapse happening behind him. I say to those doubters, we are not just guards of iron and stone. We are keepers of the flame of tradition, protectors of the idea of security, guardians of the very concept of... The speech was interrupted by a loud pop from the upper hinges, followed by an ominous silence as the entire structure seemed to hold its breath. Willem froze mid-sentence, his sword still raised in what was now clearly a defensive position rather than a rhetorical flourish. Every guard stood perfectly still, like rabbits sensing a predator. After 3 heartbeats of perfect quiet, Willem lowered his sword with deliberate calm. As I was saying, he continued, his voice only slightly higher pitched than before, our duty remains clear. We stand watch, we maintain vigilance, and we... He glanced involuntarily at the gate, then immediately regretted it as he caught sight of the new stress fractures radiating from the hinges. We do not question the time-honored traditions that have served this kingdom so well for so long. The silence that followed was broken only by the faint ticking sounds of cooling metal and the distant call of a crow that wisely chose not to land on the gate. Willem sheathed his sword with a sigh that seemed to deflate his entire performative energy. Dismissed, he muttered. And for the love of all that's holy, someone oil those damned hinges before the Duke's inspection next week. As the guards scattered to their posts with unusual haste, Willem remained standing before the gate, his back to the crumbling edifice. If anyone had been close enough to hear, they might have caught his whispered addition, or at least make sure it falls after I retire. Chapter 13. The Siege That Didn't Happen. The alarm came at midnight from a shepherd boy who swore he'd seen torchlights moving through the western pass. By the time the message reached the castle, it had transformed into an advancing army of 10,000 bloodthirsty invaders. Captain Willem was roused from his bed by a panicked page and arrived in the courtyard to find his guards in various states of undress and unreasonable terror. "They're coming," Rolf announced, strapping on his breastplate upside down. "Who's coming?" Willem asked, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Everyone," Edric said, jamming a helmet onto his head with enough force to cover his nose. "All of them." Willem peered toward the darkened hills. "I don't see anything." A distant owl hooted. The guards collectively flinched. Timmons, who had somehow managed to put his leggings on as sleeves, pointed a shaking finger westward. "What if they're being quiet?" Willem sighed. 10,000 men can't be quiet. A gust of wind made the gate groan. 5 guards drew their swords. "We need to prepare defenses," Edric said, eyeing the gate with naked terror. Willem followed his gaze. The indomitable gate, illuminated in the flickering torchlight, looked less like a fortress barrier and more like a collection of rust held together by habit and prayer. The main crack had widened enough that a particularly skinny invader could probably slip through without touching the sides. "Right," Willem said slowly. "Here's the plan. Rolf, take 3 men and..." A bush rustled 20 yards away. The guards erupted into chaos. Swords were drawn with enough dramatic flair to impress a theater troupe. One man fired a crossbow bolt into the night sky, where it disappeared forever, possibly killing a star. Another began stacking benches against the gate in what appeared to be an attempt at reinforcement, or perhaps a very poor barricade. Willem watched as Timmons tried to light the warning beacon 3 separate times before realizing he was holding the torch upside down. "Stop," Willem commanded. The word had no effect. "Stop." The guards froze mid-panic. Willem pointed at the gate. "That," he said, "is the Indomitable Gate, legendary bastion of our kingdom's defenses. It has stood for over a century against every imaginable threat." The gate chose this moment to shed another spike, which landed point first in the dirt like a dagger thrown by an angry god. Willem continued without missing a beat. "Now does anyone here actually believe it will stop so much as a determined squirrel?" The silence was answer enough. Good, Willem said. Now we're being honest. Here's the real plan. If an army comes, we run. If anyone asks, we were strategically redeploying. The guards nodded in relieved agreement. Just then, the shepherd boy reappeared, panting. False alarm, he said. Turns out it was just fireflies. The guards stared at him. Fireflies, Rolf repeated flatly. And maybe a badger, the boy added. Willem closed his eyes and counted to 10. When he opened them, he said, Everyone go back to bed. Tomorrow we're having drills, lots of drills. As the guards shuffled away, muttering about ruined sleep and unnecessary adrenaline, Willem remained in the courtyard, staring at the gate. The gate, for its part, remained impressively indifferent to the entire affair. If anything, it seemed to be leaning slightly more than before, as if exhausted by the guards' antics. Willem gave it a solemn nod. Next time, he whispered, do us all a favor and fall already. The gate creaked in what might have been agreement. Or maybe it was just the wind. Either way, no one slept well that night. Chapter 14. The gate's last defender. Of all the guards stationed at the indomitable gate, only one man still believed in its legendary invincibility. Guardsman Petya, the newest recruit, had arrived after the gate's decline had become impossible to ignore by anyone with functioning eyesight. Yet somehow, through either heroic optimism or tragic myopia, he maintained absolute faith in the crumbling structure. It just needs proper maintenance, Petya announced to the others during morning inspection, running a reverent hand along a support beam that was currently holding on through sheer force of tradition. A little elbow grease, some fresh ironwork, and she'll be good as new. The other guards exchanged glances. The beam in question had developed a pronounced S-curve overnight and was making faint whimpering noises whenever the wind changed direction. Rolf scratched his chin. You're serious? Of course. Petya beamed at the gate like a proud father. This beauty has stood for generations. What's a few cosmetic issues? Edric coughed into his hand to hide a laugh. Cosmetic issues. Timon stared at the newest crack, which had begun branching across the gate's surface like a river delta. That one looks like it's forming words. Petya waved this away. Character gives it personality. Captain Willem observed this exchange with the detached fascination of a man watching a chicken attempt to swim. He'd seen guards come and go, but never one so determined to ignore reality. There was something almost admirable about it. By week's end, Petya had become the garrison's favorite entertainment. He could be found at all hours polishing rusted sections with religious fervor, talking to the gate as if it might respond, and defending its honor in increasingly elaborate ways. When the blacksmith's apprentice joked that the gate wouldn't stop a determined toddler, Petya challenged him to a duel, with wooden swords, but the principle stood. When a visiting merchant remarked that the structure looked a bit poorly, Petya delivered a 20-minute lecture on medieval metallurgy that was half accurate and entirely passionate. The other guards began taking bets. 3 coppers says he tries to reinforce it with his own belt next, Rolf muttered as they watched Petya attempt to shore up a sagging hinge with twine, and what appeared to be chewing gum. I give it until the next rainstorm, Edric countered. That's when the west side usually sheds another plate. Timmons, ever the optimist, wagered a full silver that Petya would be the last one still standing when the gate finally collapsed. Petya remained blissfully unaware of his status as the garrison's unofficial mascot. He developed routines, morning oiling of the least rusted hinges, afternoon patrols where he pointed out the gate's best angles to anyone within earshot, evening serenades of patriotic songs that made the metal vibrate in protest. The gate, for its part, seemed to tolerate Petya with the same bemused resignation one might show an overly affectionate puppy. It groaned less when he was nearby, as if reluctant to shatter his illusions just yet. Occasionally it would shed a particularly impressive flake of rust directly into his hands, which Petya would display like a treasured gift. You see, he told the others, after one such incident, holding up a rust chunk the size of his palm. "It's sharing its history with us." Rolf squinted at the fragment. "That's the Duke's crest." "Exactly. A piece of our noble heritage." Edric leaned over to Willem. "We might need to intervene soon." Willem shook his head. "Let him have this. The rest of us gave up months ago." The breaking point came during an unusually windy afternoon when the gate began emitting a sound none of them could ignore, a deep resonant hum that made their teeth vibrate. The rest of the guards retreated to what they'd calculated was a safe distance, approximately 20 paces beyond the expected collapse zone. Petya alone approached the trembling structure, hand outstretched. "Listen," he called over the noise. "It's singing." The gate chose that moment to spit out a hinge pin the size of a man's forearm, which embedded itself in the dirt between Petyar's boots. The humming stopped. The wind died. An eerie silence fell over the courtyard. Petya stared at the pin, then at the gate, then back at the pin. Willem held his breath. Slowly, Petya bent down and picked up the pin. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. Then, with the solemnity of a priest holding a sacred relic, he looked up at the gate and said, "You must be tired." The guards waited. Petya nodded to himself. "We should let you rest." Then he turned on his heel and walked calmly to the barracks, still cradling the hinge pin. The betting pool was quietly divided 3 ways. No one had predicted this outcome, and Petyar was given a wide berth for the rest of the day. That evening, he could be seen sitting alone in the gatehouse, polishing the hinge pin and humming softly to himself. The gate, now missing a crucial support, leaned noticeably further but made no further protest. Perhaps it had said all it needed to. That night, as the guards took their posts, they gave the structure more space than usual. Whether out of respect or self-preservation, none could say. Even Petyar, still clutching his salvaged pin, kept his distance, though his gaze remained fixed on the gate with something approaching gratitude. And the gate, for the first time in living memory, stood perfectly still and silent through the long watch. Chapter 15. The Night of the Creaking Hinges. The noises began at moonrise, not the usual tired groans of metal settling, but sharp, purposeful creaks that echoed through the courtyard like a tree bending before the storm. Guardsman Rolf, halfway through his shift, froze mid-yawn as the gate let out a shriek that sent 3 nesting birds fleeing in terror. "That's new," he muttered, to no one in particular. By midnight, the sounds had evolved into something resembling speech. Not words exactly, more like the gate was attempting to form them through sheer force of metallic protest. The lower hinge produced a rhythmic knocking that might have been Morse code if any of the guards had known Morse code. The upper hinge answered with a drawn-out whine that climbed in pitch until it vanished into ultrasonic territory. Timmons, on watch with bloodshot eyes and the twitchy reflexes of a man 3 coffees past sanity, started taking notes. 10:47 p.m. Gate appears to be humming folk songs. 11:23 p.m. West hinge tapping out what might be a love poem. 15 entire structure vibrating at frequency that makes teeth aching. Captain Willem found them at dawn, huddled in the gatehouse with fingers in ears. What in the 9 hells is going on out there? Edric, who had wrapped his helmet in spare tunics to muffle the noise, looked up with the blank stare of a man who had seen beyond the veil of reality. "It's trying to communicate." Willem opened the gatehouse door. The sound hit him like a physical force, a cacophony of squeals, groans, and something that suspiciously resembled jazz improvisation. The gate itself swayed gently in the morning breeze, shedding rust flakes in time with the metallic symphony. "Right," Willem said, closing the door carefully. "We're calling the blacksmith." Marta arrived after lunch, tools in hand and skepticism firmly in place. She took one look at the gate, now emitting a sound like a whale singing through a broken trumpet, and dropped her hammer. "Oh, sweet merciful, when did this start?" "Last night," Rolf said. "No, Timmons corrected. Last night was when we noticed. It's been building for weeks. Marta circled the structure, pausing occasionally to press an ear against metal that vibrated under her touch. This isn't normal wear. We know, the guards chorused. She straightened, wiping rust from her hands. There's nothing to be done. The metal's fatigued, the supports are gone, and whatever's holding this thing up at this point is either magic or sheer stubbornness. As if in response, the gate let out a sound that could only be described as metallic laughter. The guards developed coping mechanisms. Rolf took to stuffing his ears with candle wax, which worked until the gate produced a basso profundo groan that traveled through his boots instead. Edric sang drinking songs at the top of his lungs, creating unholy duets with the structure's improvisational jazz phase. Timmons began wearing 2 helmets strapped together with a leather harness, which did nothing for the noise but made him look vaguely ecclesiastical. Petya alone seemed unbothered. It's just settling, he told them, smiling beatifically as the gate produced a sound like 100 nails on slate. Old bones creak. By week's end, sleep deprivation had eroded the last pretense of professionalism. Guards were caught napping at their posts, having conversations with the gate, and, in one memorable incident, attempting to bribe it with offerings of oil and fresh fruit. Willem found Timmons one evening, standing nose to rust with the structure, deep in what appeared to be negotiations. It's simple, Timmons was saying. You stopped the whale impression, we stopped throwing things at you. The gate responded with a perfect imitation of a cat's yowl. Timmons threw up his hands. That's not even metal. How are you doing that? Willem decided then and there to implement a new policy, mandatory earplugs, and a generous interpretation of what constituted guard duty. If that meant some shifts were spent hiding in the wine cellar with fingers in ears, so be it. That night, as the guards took turns standing watch, defined loosely as being within shouting distance of the gate, the noises reached new heights of absurdity. The structure cycled through what sounded like animal impressions, weather patterns, and at one point a credible rendition of the Duke's favorite waltz. Just before dawn, when even the owls had fled the cacophony, the gate fell suddenly silent. The abrupt quiet was somehow more alarming than the noise had been. Rolf lowered his wax-plugged ears. Is it over? As if in answer, the gate emitted one final perfect sound, the clear ringing tone of a bell announcing the hour. Then, with the air of an actor taking his final bow, it settled into watchful silence. The guards held their breath. Nothing. Slowly, cautiously, they began to hope. Maybe it was done. Maybe whatever strange madness had possessed the structure had passed. Maybe they could finally get some. The gate started tap dancing. Or something very like tap dancing, if tap shoes were made of cast iron and had a grudge against humanity. Willem looked at the sky, then at his men, then at the flask in his belt. New plan, he announced. We're all very drunk for the foreseeable future. No one argued. Chapter 16. The visitor who asked too many questions. The stranger arrived at midday, his cloak dusty from the road, but his eyes entirely too bright with curiosity. He introduced himself as Brother Aldrich, a scholar from the northern monasteries, and immediately began circling the indomitable gate with the keen interest of a man who had never learned when to stop asking questions. Fascinating construction, he mused, peering at the gate's sagging middle like a physician examining a plague victim. What sort of metallurgical process was used in the forging? The guards exchanged glances. They had fielded questions from pilgrims and tourists before, but this man spoke with the dangerous air of someone who actually expected accurate answers. Rolf cleared his throat. Dwarven steel, he said with absolute confidence, from the deep forges of Mount Vorgath. Brother Aldrich blinked. But the dwarven kingdoms fell 5 centuries before this gate was built. Family heirlooms, Edric chimed in without missing a beat. The scholar made a note in his little book. And these decorative cracks here. Not cracks, Timmons interrupted. Strategic weak points, designed to absorb siege weapon impacts. He nodded sagely. Military secret. D. Brother Aldrich's quill hovered over parchment. They look like cracks. Brilliant camouflage, Rolf said. Makes enemies think it's vulnerable. The scholar squinted at the gate, which chose that moment to shed a palm-sized flake of metal that landed at his feet with a resonant clang. He picked it up, examining the corroded edges. This appears to be standard pig iron with poor maintenance. Petya, ever the loyalist, drew himself up. That's no ordinary rust, good brother. That's sacred rust, blessed by no fewer than 3 popes and a very influential bishop. Brother Aldrich's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Blessed rust. Holier than regular rust, Petya confirmed. You can tell by the way it flakes. The scholar turned his attention to the hinges, which had recently developed a habit of weeping black streaks down the stonework. And these lubricants, dragon's blood, Edric said solemnly. Mixed with phoenix tears, Rolf added. Harvested during a lunar eclipse, Timmons finished. Brother Aldrich's notes were becoming frantic. But the tensile strength seems enhanced by wizardry, Rolf said. Which wizardry? Ancient. Todianin? Lost. Very secret. The guards nodded in unison. The scholar stepped back to take in the whole structure, his expression shifting from curiosity to dawning horror as he observed the way the entire gate listed to one side like a drunkard against a tavern wall. Surely this angle isn't intentional. Ah! Edric held up a finger. That's the famous Harrow Mount Lean, designed that way to confuse invaders about which way it opens. Also makes it harder to climb, Rolf added, and provides shade for the guards in summer. Timmons said. Brother Aldrich opened and closed his mouth several times before trying a new tactic. Perhaps I might examine the original architectural plans? The guards froze. The plans, if they had ever existed, had been lost to time, along with the architect's good sense and possibly his immortal soul. Classified, Willem said, appearing suddenly at the scholar's shoulder. State secret. The scholar turned. You're the captain? Willem nodded. Then perhaps you can tell me, why does your indomitable gate appear to be held together by luck and rust? Willem considered this. Behind him, the gate creaked ominously, as if aware it was being discussed. Have you ever heard, he asked slowly, of the living gate theory? Brother Aldrich's quill paused. I can't say I have. Surely secret, Willem said, lowering his voice conspiratorial. The gate isn't meant to be static. Its movements, its sounds, all part of a grand design. The scholar's eyes widened. You mean it's supposed to do this? Willem spread his hands. Who are we to question centuries of military engineering? Brother Aldrich stared at the gate, which chose that moment to produce a sound like a dying accordion. His scholarly certainty wavered. But the structural integrity is beyond mortal comprehension, Willem finished. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a sacred rust-polishing ceremony to attend. The guards formed a solemn procession toward the gate, Petya producing a ceremonial oil flask with a dramatic flourish. Brother Aldrich watched them go, his notebook hanging forgotten at his side. As the ceremony commenced, which involved mostly wiping the same small patch of metal while humming, the scholar turned to leave, muttering to himself about revisiting his academic sources. Rolf waited until the man was out of earshot before lowering his polishing cloth. Do you think he believed any of that? Edric snorted. Not a word. Timmons sighed. He'll be back with more questions tomorrow. Willem watched the retreating figure disappear down the road. Then we better invent some better lies. Behind them, the gate creaked in what might have been agreement, or possibly just the sound of another structural component giving up the ghost. Either way, the guards took it as approval. Petya gave the structure an affectionate pat. Don't worry, old girl. We won't let anyone question your dignity. The gate responded by dropping a hinge pin on his foot. The guards chose to interpret this as a sign of affection. Chapter 17. The guard who walked away. They found Tom's resignation pinned to the gatehouse door with a rusted dagger, the parchment fluttering in the morning breeze like a white flag of surrender. The note contained only 7 words, scratched with the hurried desperation of a man fleeing a burning building. Is ye rather God a bridge troll? The remaining guards gathered around the message in solemn silence. Each privately calculating how many years of service stood between them and their own dramatic exit. Treasoner, Cedric muttered unconvincingly, squinting at the note as if greater scrutiny might reveal some redeeming quality to Tom's betrayal. Unconscionable, Rolf agreed, his tone suggesting he'd recently looked up the word and was trying it out. Timon said nothing, his gaze drifting from the note to the gate, which today leaned at an angle that defied both geometry and common sense, then back to the note. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Captain Willem arrived last, still fastening his cloak, and took in the scene with the weary acceptance of a man who'd been expecting this since the first hinge gave out. He plucked the dagger from the wood, examined Tom's note, then sighed so deeply it seemed to originate in his boots. "Well," he said, folding the parchment neatly, "at least he left his badge." The badge in question lay on the gatehouse steps, polished to a shine that mocked their own tarnished sense of duty. Willem scooped it up and pocketed it, the motion triggering a quiet clink. The sound of a growing collection. The day's patrol passed in unusual silence. Where normally the guards might trade jabs about the gate's latest deterioration or invent new euphemisms for its impending collapse, today they walked their rounds like men at a funeral. Even the gate seemed subdued, its usual chorus of groans reduced to occasional whimpers, as if sensing the shift in morale. At dusk, they gathered in the barracks for what passed for a send-off in their line of work. A bottle of questionable whiskey and increasingly transparent lies about Tom's shortcomings as a guardsman. "Remember how terrible he was at polishing the hinge?" Rolf offered, pouring drinks that smelled vaguely medicinal. "Worst hinge polisher I ever saw," Edric agreed, accepting his cup with a solemn nod. "Couldn't tell a stress fracture from decorative engraving," Timmons added, uncharacteristically generous with the pour. Willem raised his cup. "To Tom, may his bridge troll be merciful." The whiskey burned going down, which at least gave them something else to focus on besides their own simmering envy. Later, when the others had retired to their bunks or their brooding, Timmons found Willem in the gatehouse, reviewing duty rosters. The captain didn't look up as the younger man hovered in the doorway, but his shoulders tensed slightly, a man bracing for another resignation. "He just walked away," Timmons said finally, the words coming out half question, half accusation. Willem set down his quill. "People do that sometimes." But his oath. The gate was supposed to be unbreakable too. Willem rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking every minute of his 50-odd years. "At some point, son, you have to decide which is stronger, your promises or your survival instinct." Timmons opened his mouth, then closed it as the gate outside emitted a particularly phlegmy cough. Both men waited to see if it would escalate into one of its nightly symphonies, but it subsided with what could only be described as a metallic sigh. Willem returned to his paperwork, the dismissal clear. Timmons lingered a moment longer, watching the lamplight flicker across the duty logs, the careful records of watches kept, inspections passed, and lies told with straight faces. His gaze snagged on Tom's name, still appearing on the rotation for next week, and something in his chest tightened. Out in the courtyard, the moon cast long shadows across the gate's faltering bulk. Timmons walked its perimeter slowly, counting each new fissure, each weeping joint, each spike that had surrendered to gravity. At the northeast corner, where the foundation had sunk nearly a foot into the earth, he paused and placed one hand against the cold metal. The gate shuddered under his touch, not the dramatic groans of its performance for the others, but a faint vibration like the last tremors of a dying man's breath. Timmons snatched his hand back, staring at his palm as if it might bear rust stains. Inside the barracks, Rolf and Edric were placing bets on who would crack next. The coins clinked softly against the wooden table, a cheerful sound, at odds with the quiet desperation clinging to the walls. Neither noticed when Timmons slipped out the back door, his footsteps unusually loud in the pre-dawn hush. Neither saw him pause at the gatehouse, his hand hovering over the door where Tom's note had hung. Neither heard the soft, decisive snick as he unbuckled his sword belt and laid it neatly on the steps. By the time Willem found the second resignation, this one reading simply "I gone a-fishing," the sun had risen on another day of dutiful pretending. The captain pocketed the note with practiced ease, added another badge to his collection, and went to wake the remaining guards for another shift of guarding the impossible. The gate, for its part, said nothing, though if anyone had been listening closely, they might have heard what sounded like approval in its wheezing breaths. Chapter 18. The day the gate held. The attack came at dawn, not a full assault, but a ragged band of highwaymen who'd mistaken the castle's crumbling exterior for easy prey. They rushed the indomitable gate with the confidence of men who'd never encountered anything more formidable than a locked pantry, axes swinging at the rusted metal with drunken enthusiasm. The guards, who had spent months documenting the gate's every wheeze and tremble, watched in horror as the first blade struck. "That's not," Rolf began. "He shouldn't," Edric tried. The axe connected with a resounding clang that shook loose a shower of rust flakes, and one surprised-looking spider. The gate shuddered, not the dramatic collapse they'd all envisioned, but a full-body flinch like an old hound too tired to do more than twitch at flies. Against all reason, it held. The highwaymen, emboldened by cheap ale and poorer judgment, redoubled their efforts. Blades rained down on the ancient metal, each impact producing a sound like a badly tuned bell choir. The gate groaned and complained, but to the guards' mounting disbelief, it refused to fall. Willem was the first to recover from his shock. "Well, defend it!" The guards sprang into action with the frantic energy of men who'd spent too long waiting for disaster to strike. Edric loosed an arrow that went wide but startled the attackers into breaking formation. Rolf brought a shield down on one man's foot with satisfying crunch. Petjar, ever the gate's staunchest defender, charged forward, bellowing a war cry that was half prayer, half construction recommendation. "Steel-braced corners, you bastards!" By the time the skirmish ended, the highwaymen fleeing with nothing to show for their efforts but notched blades and wounded pride. The guards stood panting before a gate that looked, if possible, even worse for wear, but somehow still upright. "It held," Timmons whispered, reaching out to touch a new dent. The metal was warm from the assault, vibrating faintly under his fingers like a spent racehorse. Edric kicked at an abandoned axe. "This makes no sense." Rolf squinted at the gate as if it were playing an elaborate trick. That last swing should have gone right through. But Petjar was beaming, his face alight with vindication. "I told you, the old girl's still got fight in her." Willem said nothing, running a hand along a fresh scar in the metal, one that had come within a hair's breadth of being an exit wound. His expression hovered somewhere between relief and dread, as though the gate's stubborn survival was somehow more troubling than its collapse would have been. As the others celebrated, Rolf already embellishing the story for tavern retellings, Edric inspecting each new mark with professional interest, Emmons noticed what no one else had. The gate's main crack had widened during the attack. Not much. Just enough to slip a knife blade through. Just enough to matter. He caught Willem's eye and nodded toward the fissure. The captain's face darkened, but he shook his head sharply, a silent order to keep quiet. That night the usual bets were placed on how long the gate would last, but the game had lost its humor. The stakes felt heavier now that they'd seen the alternative, a world where the gate stood firm while men bled against it. Petjar raised a toast to another century of service, but the cheer that followed was half-hearted at best. Even he trailed off as the gate emitted its usual bedtime groan, a sound that now carried new weight. Willem retired early, claiming paperwork, but Timmons saw him pause by the gate on his way to the barracks. The captain placed one hand against the battered metal, his lips moving in silent words that might have been gratitude or apology. The gate, for its part, settled into the night with unusual quiet, as if exhausted by its uncharacteristic show of strength. If it knew what its survival meant, that its guards were now trapped between hope and dread, that their comfortable expectations of failure had been upended, it gave no sign. Only the crack, barely visible in the moonlight, seemed to hint at the truth, that today's victory had only postponed the inevitable, and that when the end finally came, it would be on the gate's terms, not theirs. Timmons lay awake long into the night, listening to the familiar chorus of creaks and groans, and wondered which would be worse, a gate that fell too soon, or one that refused to fall at all. Outside the indomitable gate stood watch, its new dents gleaming faintly in the starlight, its posture somehow prouder than before, as if it too knew something had changed. And in the darkness, the crack waited. Chapter 19. The Final Shift. The gate waited until the quietest hour of the night watch to die. Guardsman Rolf would later swear it had been trying to warn them. The groans had taken on a new pitch that evening, not the usual complaints of tired metal, but something closer to speech. At moonrise, it had produced a perfect imitation of a death rattle that sent 2 new recruits fleeing to the barracks. By midnight, the creaks had synchronized into a rhythm suspiciously like a heartbeat slowing. Rolf was polishing the ceremonial hinge, now more ritual than function, when the first true crack spiderwebbed across the gate's face with a sound like ice breaking. He froze, cloth still pressed to metal, gone suddenly warm under his fingers. "It's happening," he whispered to no one. Edric, dozing against the gatehouse wall, jerked awake at the noise. His eyes locked onto the growing fracture with the resignation of a man who'd known this moment would come yet somehow never believed it actually would. "Should we tell someone?" Before Rolf could answer, the gate made the decision for them. With a sigh that started as a whisper and built to a deafening metallic scream, the indomitable gate began its final surrender. Timmons, on perimeter patrol, would describe it afterward as watching a mountain decide to lie down. The upper spikes went first, shearing off in slow motion and embedding themselves in the courtyard like javelins thrown by giants. The central arch folded inward with eerie grace, as if bowing to some invisible audience. And then, with one last groan that shook the ground beneath them, the entire structure slumped into a pile of scrap that looked nothing like the fortress barrier it had once been. The silence that followed was absolute. Petya arrived last, having slept through the initial collapse. He took one look at the wreckage and burst into laughter, so loud it startled birds from the castle walls. "Finally," he gasped between wheezes. "Oh, thank the gods, finally." The others stared at him, unsure whether to join in or arrange for his immediate confinement. Wilhelm appeared moments later, still fastening his cloak, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn light. He surveyed the damage with the air of a man tallying up overdue accounts. "Anyone hurt?" Rolf shook his head. "Any property damage beyond this?" A gesture toward what had once been the kingdom's pride. Edric pointed to a bench now pinned under several hundred pounds of decorative ironwork. "Might need a new seating area." Wilhelm nodded, as if this were just another daily report. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he smiled. A small, tired thing that looked equal parts relieved and bewildered. "Well," he said, "I suppose we're out of a job." The guards stood in a loose circle around the remains, no one quite sure what protocol applied. There should have been ceremony, Timmons thought. Fanfare. At least a properly dramatic last stand. Not this quiet folding, like an old man forgetting how to stand. Rolf was the first to move, bending down to pick up a twisted piece of metal, all that remained of the famous shining hinge. He turned it over in his hands, watching the dawn light catch on its uneven edges. "What do we do now?" The answer came from an unexpected quarter. Petya, still grinning like a madman, clapped him on the shoulder. whatever we want." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the others to stare at his retreating back and then at each other. Edric exhaled sharply through his nose. "He's right, you know." Willem rubbed his face, the weight of years suddenly visible in the lines around his eyes. "Report to the barracks at noon. I'll inform the Duke." As the captain walked stiffly toward the castle, the remaining guards lingered by the rubble, each lost in their own thoughts. The gate had defined their days for so long that its absence felt like a missing tooth. Impossible not to probe. Rolf pocketed the hinge fragment. Edric salvaged a spike that had survived mostly intact. Timon simply stood and stared, remembering every groan, every crack, every moment they'd spent waiting for this exact disaster. Somewhere in the castle, a bell tolled the hour, its clear tone ringing out over the silent courtyard. The guards turned as one toward the sound, then back to the pile of scrap at their feet. The indomitable gate had fallen, and somehow, against all odds, they were still standing. Chapter 20. The Aftermath. A new gate. Same promises. The new gate arrived on the first day of spring, hauled in by a team of oxen and no fewer than 12 sweating laborers. It was magnificent, taller than the last, thicker than the last, and polished to a shine that hurt the eyes in direct sunlight. The Duke, never one to learn from history, had named it Whitenham before the final nail had even been driven. The surviving guards stood at attention as the architect, a young man with the unfortunate optimism of someone who had never seen one of his creations age, explained its revolutionary design. "Reinforced with woven steel," he declared, slapping a hand against metal that rang with perfect, untested solidity. Rolf coughed into his fist. Edric studied the sky with sudden interest. "Blessed by the High Cleric himself," the architect continued, gesturing to faint holy engravings along the frame. Timon's eye twitched. Willem, now sporting a new ceremonial sash that marked him as keeper of the Unbreakable, stood rigid beside the Duke, his face carefully blank. Only the white-knuckled grip on his sword belt betrayed him. The ceremony proceeded exactly as the last one had decades earlier. Fresh-faced recruits swore oaths to guard the gate until it fell. The Duke gave a speech about eternal security. The blacksmith presented an ornamental hammer for the ritual first strike, a symbolic gesture that, if taken literally, would have voided the warranty immediately. When the time came for the guards to approach and inspect their new charge, they moved like men walking to their own executions. Rolf was first. He placed a hesitant hand against the cold metal, half expecting it to groan under his touch. When it didn't, he frowned. Edric crouched to examine the hinges, his fingers tracing flawless joins that had yet to know rust. His mouth tightened. Timon simply stood before the towering structure, staring up at spikes that had never shed, at surfaces that had never cracked, at an entire edifice that had yet to disappoint. His breath came slow and measured, as if waiting for the first betrayal. Petya, the only one who hadn't left after the fall, was conspicuously absent, until they found him around back, carving a single word into the foundation stone where no one would see. Eventually, the recruits, bright-eyed and beaming with pride, took their positions along the ramparts. They joked about easy duty, about legendary gates that would never fail, about honor that would never tarnish. The old guard said nothing. They simply watched and waited and remembered. As the sun set on the first day of Yternum's vigil, Willem lingered in the courtyard long after the others had left. He studied the new gate from every angle, noting the way the twilight caught on unblemished metal, how the shadows pooled differently than they had around the old one. Somewhere in the castle, a feast was being held to celebrate the new installation. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted through the open windows, mingling with the first evening birdsong. Willem reached into his pocket and withdrew a rusted hinge fragment, the last piece of the indomitable gate. He turned it over in his palm, watching as the dying light caught on its pitted surface. Then, with the care of a man laying a loved one to rest, he tucked it into a crevice at the base of the new gate, where it would rest unseen against virgin iron. A tribute. A warning. A promise. Above him, the first guard shift changed with all the ceremony their predecessors had once shown. Boots clicked on stone. Swords were passed. The night watch began its vigil over another eternal gate. And somewhere in the foundations, if one listened very closely, the faintest sigh of metal settling into its fate might have been heard, or perhaps it was just the wind. Willem allowed himself one last look at the gleaming monstrosity that would dominate the rest of his career. Then he turned away, shoulders straight, footsteps measured, walking into the twilight like a man who knew how this story would end, but would play his part regardless. Behind him, Vietnam stood silent and proud in the gathering dark, waiting.